Hello, and welcome to the March edition of Kitchener-Waterloo Video Tech Meetup. Today, we welcome Trevor Chan, who I've been asking for a long time to come and do a presentation. Grateful for you making the time. And a little bit about Trevor. He's been working in streaming media since the 90s .com bubble, and he's got stories. We were just saying about how much war stories is really cool to hear from, and so he's a video solutions architect contracted to Bell Media, and he's helping the organization with the digital broadcast transformation, and he's going to tell us a little. This is story time with Trevor.
Thanks, Chris. And so off the top, I just want to apologize to everyone. This is going to be a very technical talk. It's just more me talking smack for like half an hour about what I've been up to and what's been going on with the Canadian telco industry, right? So for the people who may be tuning in who are not from Canada, I'm going to apologize because a lot of these are very, I'm going to make a lot of references specific to the Canadian ecosystem. But I hope that some of the stories I tell is going to be, I don't know, applicable for other regions around the world. So hopefully this works okay. So agenda. So we're gonna start off, with the obligatory intro. I'll tell you guys a little bit about what I'm up to, what I'm about, what I've done. And basically the next two sections are going to be the core of the presentation. It's going to be, it's typically just problems and solutions, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's some more of the challenges that are facing big media. And when I say big media, I'm talking specifically about like broadcast television, right? And then I'll talk about a little bit some of the strategies that I've employed in my adventures in order to help modernize the workflow for a lot of the broadcasters in this country, right? And then I'm hoping we can spend a lot of time with the Q&A session, and it's more of an open conversation. And like I said, I'm not going to be presenting any like workflow diagrams or anything like that. So feel free to interrupt me at any time. Chris, you may want to let me know if someone's like got a question or has something to say, because I'm probably going to be looking at my screen and my notes, so I won't be paying attention to what's going on the Google Meet side. Okay.
Yep. Yeah, and then is it okay if there's like Google Meet has a raise your hand part? Is that fine? If like
cool.
Okay. Yeah.
It's all good. Guys, think of this as just everyone here. Just think of this as a very fluid conversation, right? Like pretend you're talking to your team on a private Slack channel. That's kind of what this is about, right? Okay, so let's get into it. Okay, so once again, my name is Trevor. I've been involved in streaming media since the first .com boom and bust, and I could definitely tell you at that time, man, there was no money in streaming media. No one really cared about it, right? So over the years, I think I spent like 2/3 of my time working in startups of various sizes, anything from small groups of maybe like 5 to 10 people, all the way to like large telcos, right? So a third of my time has been spent with the large players in the country. That includes both Rogers and Bell. Currently, I'm a contractor at Bell, right? So that's where I think a lot of my conversation is going to be. I don't want to bore you so much with my resume or my CV, right? But I do want to focus in a little bit about around the time, 2015. Okay, so this is why I was still at Rogers, right? So when I was at Rogers, I ended up working for a division that created an SVOD platform to compete against Netflix, right? So people have been around in the industry for a while. You may have heard something called Show Me. That was Rogers' like play into the SVOD world, right? And so it launched around like I'd say fall of 2014, right? And actually, this is when I first got into the cloud, right? Because when we launched the Show Me service in 2014, right, all of our stuff was like hosted on-prem data center, right? Oh my God, man! Like, whoa! Off the bat, we had like record viewerships, right? I think within a quarter, we had already exhausted our commits, right? Everywhere from like bandwidth to storage, like you name it, right? So basically said, okay, you guys gotta get out of here, man. Like, we're getting screwed here on this deal, right? So they, oh man, what are we gonna do, man? Like, we're a victim of our own success, right? So he said, okay, let's get into AWS, right? That's how we get the scalability, right? So in 2015, that was one of my jobs. Like, oh man, we gotta get it off the data center. We gotta get into AWS, right? And at that point, it was trial by fire. Like, there's no one training you how to do this. You just gotta like go on and like look at like do a bunch of Google searches and whatever, just figure out what you're doing, right? So we got into into the cloud, right? And I'd say like since then, right? Okay, so more history. The Show Me service like closed in 2016, right? And that's like, you know, if you guys pay attention to like what's going on in Canadian media, especially Rogers, oh my God, I'm telling you, even back then, it was straight out of like the HBO show Succession, right? The Rogers kids, they're all involved, like trying to hijack everything. Oh my God, it was a gong show over there, right? So I got out and I got back to my roots, which is in the startup world, right? You know, so you know, kind of at that point. And so the reason why I bring this up is because at Rogers, like I said, so I was involved in helping them transition to the cloud. So I kind of thought that, you know what, hey, this is the way it's going to go. All right, this seems to be the natural trajectory was going to be, right? Okay, fast forward to the pandemic, right? Okay, so now you know I get an opportunity to start working at Bell, right, and some other startups as well. Oh my God, when I got in at Bell especially, oh these are total like laggards, you know what I mean? It's like you out over there, you get all this pushback and stuff like this, right? And I'm like, wow, I'm not used to this, right? So I think for most of my career, like I wouldn't say I'm on bleeding edge of technology or anything like that, but I would say like, you know, pretty I'm working on like pretty modern stacks, right? When I started working at Bell, it's on 2021. Oh man, I think I spent most of my time being like a psychologist, right? You know, and just trying to tease everyone. Oh, this is what it's about. Like more tutoring and mentoring, right? There's a lot. I'm not used to this, right? I'm just used to building stuff and just going, right? You know, so that was a bit of transition. But here's the other thing too, and that's actually one of the other reasons for this talk. So a lot of the people I work with, a lot of my colleagues, what they ended up doing was they ended up working either with the cloud companies and pro services, or they work with consultancies, right? And that's trying to help like enterprise customers get into the cloud. And talk, it's the exact same conversation every single time. It's like, oh my God, what's up with these companies, man? What's with the cloud skepticism? How come no one wants to do here? Blah, blah, blah. So I'm thinking, oh my God, okay, so if we're talking about it, I figure maybe the broader vid tech community, maybe they're undergoing the same type of like conversations, right? So I figure, okay, maybe this is not a bad talk after all, you know? Okay, so let's get into it. So this is the obligatory, hey, what's going on in the broadcast industry, you know? So, you know, I just want to set the level, set the field. I'm sure like a lot of you guys like already know like, what's going on here, right? So what we've been seeing, especially in the past decade, I'd see, is the adoption of IP video and OTT distribution. So when I'm talking about IP video and broadcast perspective, it's more about changing things from like broadband, I mean like baseband SDI connections to stuff like 2110 and PIG access, you name it, right? You know, so basically what you're doing instead of like laying like physical like optical cables around the plant, now you're doing network cables, right? Like that's where it's headed, right? On the OTT, on the distribution side, it's all going OTT, right? So you know, there's one thing to do like streaming services, like from around 2010 or so, like trying to copy the Netflix model. But I think what you've been seeing, especially from a lot of large cable companies, is now they're kind of adopting OTT as well, right? So before they're doing stuff like on net, like over their own like over their own like their own networks, right? But as like you know, as things has been progressing over the past decade, right? They're seeing well, their customers they want to view their television like programming over different devices and stuff like this, right? So now you're off net, and now you're going OTT, right? So that's a big culture shift for a lot of the broadcasters, right? Because they're not used to this, right? They're used to like in their own like a private network, basically, right? Now you gotta go public, right? And it's a whole different ballgame there when you talk about that, right? You know, there's also on-prem hardware, right? You know, probably the past like 5 years, what's been going on is like a lot of your equipment is reaching end of life, right? So now you're faced with the questions. Well, do we refresh it? Do we just buy more servers? Do we want to put stuff in the cloud? What are we going to do, right? Do I know how to do it? You know, so those are a lot of the questions what you're hearing, right? You know, Bell, Rogers, like you name it, everyone's going through this, right? And I think and I kind of alluded to this earlier, but there are raised expectations with big tech, right? You look at, you got a generation of viewers, right, who've been raised on Netflix, YouTube, TikTok, like you name. You talk to any young person, they're like, ads? What's this? How come I gotta wait till like Friday at 8 o'clock to watch this show? Like, what is this, right? Why can't I watch it now? So yeah, maybe for the old heads, right? You remember the old traditional like way of broadcasting, right? They're used to that, right? But anyone, younger people, you got no time for that, right? It's all about on demand. That's what it's about, right? So I think the broadcast industry, I hate to admit this, right? But I'm talking some real trash now. This is my theory, guys. What I think is going on is like a lot of decision makers, especially in the big telcos, they don't use streaming services, right? They're used to their set-top boxes and stuff like this, right? So that's how they experience like television, right? So when they're trying to make decisions on how stuff is going to look like on a mobile device and stuff like that, they don't really know. Yeah, sure, they'll go on, they'll look on their social media feeds, or someone sends them like they'll look at it, but that's not primarily how they're consuming television, right? They're more about the 10-foot experience, right? The more lean back, right? And then you think, well, man, if the decision makers themselves are not experiencing media this way, how are they making the right decisions? For the rest of us, right? Like what is that? Anyway, now I'm ranting, so I better stop. Chris, go for it.
So, in terms of like contribution partners, how do you find that they've changed over the past decade or so?
I definitely say like now it's right. I'd say some of the newer the next generation providers, like they're very open about sending like SRT feeds, right? So I'd say SRT for sure. And okay, I'll give you an example. So at Bell Media specifically, I work a lot of sports, right? So all the live sport that you see for TSN, right? That's probably what I spend most of my time doing, right? I can definitely tell you when I'm onboarding new content providers, I mandate you got to send me SRT, man. I'm not taking anything else, right? Forget it. Spend your $500, whatever, upgrade your encoders. Come on, this is nothing, right? You can do it. It's not a big deal. If a schmuck like me can figure out how to do this, you can do it, right? Not only that, I've actually taught people. I would hold their hands on how to do it. Easy. It's not a big deal. If you can do RTMP, SRT is way easier, man, in my opinion. So you can handle it, right? So I think a lot of people, especially for sports, have been very receptive to that.
Is there in Canada, like I know in the US and how like traditional kind of broadcast partnerships work is via satellite. Is that still like at the Bell and Rogers head ends? Are they still receiving feeds over satellite?
They're still getting satellite and fiber feeds.
Okay.
But I would say a lot of that has more to do with the comfort of the operations staff, right? Because it's kind of like, hey, this is just the way they've been doing it like forever, right? So this is what they're used to, right? But as especially when you're doing SRT, the contribution feeds, it's a lot cheaper, right? When you're doing over like IP networks, right? So definitely when we talk to all the execs and the controllers, you show them this, like, oh, what the hell? This is way better, man. Why'd you force everyone to use SRT, right? Well, hey, slow down. We're getting there, we're getting there, right? But it's honestly, there's a lot of set processes in place. It's going to take time to transition everyone to the future, right? But SRT, especially over, let's say, versus a proprietary protocol like Zixi, is a lot more appealing. Like, I know when Zixi first came out, it's a bit of a challenge, especially for the smaller providers, right? They don't want to put up the cash to invest in that infrastructure, right? SRT being open source, there's a lot more options. You can just spin up FFmpeg really if you want to, right? And do it that way. Like alleviated all the hesitancy of the. Is that cool?
I think you're dropping in and out, Trevor.
Oh, sorry guys. Yeah.
No.
Sorry, home internet network. It's kind of flaky. I don't. And by the way, I don't use any of the big providers. I use a small ISP. That's why. Okay, so let's get into it. All right. Okay, so this is specifically what I'm seeing from the big telcos, right? It's what I call the culture of fear, right? So look, let's be honest. In Canada, it's pretty much an oligopoly up here, right? You've only got a handful of providers. They control all of our connectivity, right? So I think what I've seen across the board, there seems to be a focus more on stemming losses and cost savings instead of looking for revenue opportunities, right? So this is what I'm talking about when I say like a scarcity versus a growth mindset, right? They're all about, hey, let's just bring down the cost, right? But very rarely do you have like conversations about, hey, let's grow the pie. What else can we do? How can we take advantage of the cloud to increase the revenue opportunities, right? So there's a kind of like a lack of an entrepreneurial mindset, especially in the enterprise. For sure, like when I'm working in startups, this is what we're all about, right? Hey, because it's like a lean and mean organization. Like, what can we do, right? So that's kind of the different mindsets that you're dealing with, right? The other thing, it's like I'll get into is kind of the skills gap, right? This is more of a psychological observation, right? So this is what I've seen. I think like a lot of the people, especially like when you look at broadcast engineers, they probably spent their entire career building out these like on premises like infrastructure, right? Physical servers, laying down cables, whatever. That's kind of their comfort zone, right? Like these are all very smart, intelligent people, right? So what I think is like they got a lot of their self identity in these like large systems that they developed, right? So when someone comes along and says, hey, what you're doing is wrong, we got to go in the cloud instead, right? Maybe there's a bit of fear, like, oh, what the, now I'm getting out of my comfort zone, right? And it's kind of like a lot of people have noticed, they're just spending their day-to-day with maintenance, right? You're saddled with technical debt. You gotta make sure the lights are still on, right? Maybe you don't have time to think about growth and what new ways of doing things are, right? So and this is more of a reminder to more of the software and for the developer people, right? I always got to remind people, you know what? Day two is sometimes harder than day one. When you got a greenfield, yeah, it's easy to build stuff, right? But when you guys actually support it for day two, oh, that's a different ball game right there, right? That alone is complicated, right? So hey, don't go dissing these old heads because they got this because they're doing day two stuff, right? That's just as hard and just as important, all right? And back to the fear thing, right? The final thing, of course, is corporate security, right? You talk to especially all the large telcos, no one wants to get hacked, right? And so people are extra paranoid and for good reason, right? Now, me being on the video side of things, right? I get a little annoyed, right? Because I'm like, yo, hold on a second here, man. I'm not hosting like credit card numbers. These are just video bits that are ephemeral, man. Like I send out video bits that are gone in a bit. Who's gonna hack this stuff, right? And then I also say to them, hey, man, you don't think I care about security? Yo, if my stuff gets leaked, we're gonna lose the contract, right? HBO's not gonna send us their stuff. Like, yo, that's important, man. Of course I care about this, right? We just care about a different type of security, right? But it's security nonetheless, right? Okay, so what else want to get into? Okay, once again, if it's not obvious by now, hey, I'm not an accountant. I don't have a financial background, right? But because we're talking about large systems, these things are not cheap, right? So I think the first thing that always comes into play, if you haven't heard this term before, it's capex versus opex, right? Capital expenditure versus operational expenditures, right? So when you're working with telcos, I think the way the markets when they evaluate their returns, and they actually focus a lot on the capital expenditures, right? Because traditionally that's how like the cable companies and the telephone companies, right? That's how they do the returns, right? They buy all these like they spend a lot on capital expenditures, like a lot of hardware, physical infrastructure, and they depreciate it over X amount of years, right? So this generates very consistent returns to their shareholders, right? So the moment you do something like go into the cloud, this is more OpEx, right? Operations expenditures, right? Now, as a startup, hey, that's great. I don't have to buy all this gear, right? I just pay for what I use for, right? So it's very easy to start up, right? That's not so much with like the large enterprises, right? Just because it's the way they do their accounting and the expectations from their shareholders, it's a lot different, right? So every time you try to like propose some sort of like a cloud project, they're like, oh, I don't know, it's too much OpEx. We're gonna go beyond, we're not gonna meet our revenue target, blah blah blah. And I'm like, man, I don't want to hear that. This money's gonna get spent one way or the other, right? I don't care if it's gonna be, you got to spend it, right? You know what I mean? I don't care if it's in the cloud or on-prem infrastructure. It's got to get done, right? So I don't know. That's a never-ending battle, right? The other thing too is what I've been calling weaponized cloud pricing, right? Okay, let me throw a little something to the audience. You let me know you've heard this before, right? Okay, so you're trying to like propose a cloud project. You're probably working with some sort of like project manager or a solutions architect, right? Who's very against it, right? Meaning they don't know what's going on. So when they calculate the cost, right? Okay, they just use a retail calculator, right, from the cloud provider, right? Say, oh my god, it's gonna cost this amount of money, and I'm like, dude, yo, we're 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 like a large telco, man. We can negotiate prices. You're never gonna be paying retail, right? That's just a guideline on what to go with. That number is for like janky ass startups where I come from, right? You're paying that BS rate, right? Not the telcos. You can get it way more down than that, right? And sometimes people don't want to hear it, So it's kind of like, I don't want to go into conspiracy theory territory. Right? Sometimes like, man, you guys are just to kill the project, man. You don't want to do it, so you're just going to say it costs this much, right? So that's just ridiculous, right? And of course, when you talk about cloud versus on-prem pricing, there's always invisible costs, right? Well, hey, when you're comparing these costs, are you including, I don't know, power for the year, cooling, rack space? Probably not, but you look at the cloud costs, that's all included, right? So it's never a true apples to apples comparison, right? And this kind of goes to the last point. I call it lift and shift versus innovation, right? So lift and shift, if you haven't heard this term before, it's just about taking like whatever you're doing on your on-prem infrastructure and doing the exact same thing in the cloud, right? So I don't know. Say you're running a bunch of servers, right? Okay, let's spin a bunch of like compute instances, right, in the cloud to do the same thing, right? Yeah, you can, right? Really taking advantage of this stuff, right? So I don't know. It's never the same. All right, so let me go on. I have a feeling I'm probably preaching to the choir, so let's get to the good stuff, right? So all right, Trevor, how are we gonna do this, man? I want to be in the cloud too. How do we overcome all these hesitations, right? So I'm breaking it down in different categories, right? So let's first talk about people and culture. So I think the first thing you gotta do is what I call you gotta build your tribe, right? So you gotta start talking to people, right? And so this is what I've done, right? So I try scheduling a lot of meetings. I try to think of who can I ally with, right? Who are the forward thinkers in this organization, right? People who are very curious and more importantly ambitious, right? Typically, look, I'll be honest, man. I'm an old head. I'm not, I'm not a young pup here, right? But it's weird that how come I'm the old guy and I'm pushing all this innovation, right? I see people way younger than me. I'm talking about decades younger than me. You're so conservative. Oh, they don't want to do that. I'm like, dude, what's up, man? You gotta. This is the career. You gotta look out for your career. This is where it's headed. You gotta learn this stuff, right? Like what is this, right? Anyways, there's usually when you talk about like a large organization, there's gonna be people who are striving, right? Maybe they were held down under the old regime, right? Because they couldn't move up, right? Cloud's different. This is your opportunity, right? So I'd say find your tribe and use corporate politics to your advantage. All right, now here.
Breaking up a little bit.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, just like.
Yeah, I'll go slow again.
Yeah.
Okay. So all the major cloud providers, they're going to have some sort of training sessions available for you, right? So you talk to them and they can help organize training sessions with your staff and your colleagues, right? Here's a more important thing, which I'm calling accreditation incentives, right?
Is that?
Oh, so someone had a question? No? Okay, I'll keep on going. Here's the thing. When you work for a lot of the cloud providers, they actually get credits for training training their customers, right? So that's why it's very easy to find people to help you from the cloud providers to help train your staff, because the people who are doing the training, it's going to look good on their resume internally when they try to get promotion, right? So they've got a lot of incentives to help you out, right? So all you gotta do is ask, just ask for it, and they'll help you arrange like a training session for your crew, right? So it's I don't think people advertise this much, but yeah, it's out there, right? You know, and same thing with like doing like demos, right? So once you get the cloud providers to help you with the training session, right? I think it's very important that if you're an evangelist within your company, you need to lead the demos, right? To show your colleagues how to do things, right? Because I think it's way more important if you could say you work for like a broadcaster like me, right? If you're doing a demo with our own content, it looks way more impressive than doing something with, I don't know, like say you're streaming Big Buck Bunny or something like that, right? That's it is what it is, right? But like that sounds good, right? For me, I'd rather some context, right? So Bell Media, we own stuff like TSN and CTV and stuff like that, right? So when I'm doing my demos, right, I always make sure to use our own content, right? So that way people can relate and they have more context to what I'm doing, right? So I find that's pretty good, right? Now hackathons, it honestly this depends. This depends on your organization and how you work, right? For sure, I think it's more valuable for startups, right? In large companies, they never seem to do it right. It always comes off as cheesy, right? And I always make the joke, hey man, my whole job is a hackathon. All I do is hack all day long, right? So I personally don't think it's useful for the stuff I do, right? Because I'm usually involved in the next generation stuff, right? But you know what? It is good for team building. And sometimes I think if this is what it takes to get people comfortable on using new services, okay, let's get a hackathon every quarter or whatever it is. Let's just do it. If this is what it takes to get people involved, so be it, right? And I think the last thing is I want to talk about is the cloud credits, right? Once again, talk to your cloud providers. Usually, what you can do is you can get a ton of credits off them, or if you, especially you let them know, hey, I just want the credits so I can open a sandbox account and get my team in here just to try things out, right? That way they're not scared, right? Now you want to let them know, hey man, don't leave your computer on 24/7 if you're not using it. Come on, man, show some restraint here, right? You want to teach some good habits, right? But I think other thing and talk regularly with your technology partners, right? Schedule regular meetings, and more importantly, you should control the agenda. Don't let them send you like a meeting list every time. Like, you should be the one that's creating like the meeting agenda, right? So that way, you make sure whatever issues you have in mind are addressed, right? Because you know what, at the end of the day, if you just leave it to your technology partners and stuff, they're just going to sell you stuff all the time, man. That's not very I don't want to put an us versus them like mentality, right? But like, you gotta like sometimes when people present you with stuff, yeah, it could be, it could be a valuable tool for down the road, right? But at the same time, you just want to say to them, yo, man, how come you didn't address my bug report, man? What the hell, right? That's why you gotta set the agenda, right? And to make sure that your issues are addressed, right? To go forward, right? Oh man. And I guess the last thing I want to put in this point, hey, at the end of the day, people just want to survive, man. They just want to keep their jobs, right? I think a lot from what I've seen, that this goes back to the culture of fear, right? Even though like a lot of people, they may want to go in the cloud, they feel that this is the way they go. They don't want to raise their hands, right? Because oh man, maybe they feel defeated. They think this is too big of an organizational shift. It can't happen, right? So I think a lot of this is about persuasion, overcoming people's fear, right? And finding ways to demonstrate that the cloud is viable in your organization, right? I think especially at this point, most people know by now, like, this is the way it's going, right? But how do you implement it? Like those are the biggest questions. All right. Okay, so let's get a little bit more about technology, right? It's nothing too crazy here. I think this is pretty, I hope it's pretty obvious, right? But it's always start small, just have proof of concepts, have a bunch of pilot programs of what you can do. It's like, what do my colleagues say? I think he uses the term as it's the art of the possible, just show people like what this technology is able to do. Now, you know, don't come from like the like a like the pulpit and say, hey, this is what we're doing. Okay, this is my way, the highway. It's gonna be this. No. That's not what this is about, right? You just want to show people like what's possible, what you could do, right? Now, I think a lot of times, especially in the enterprises, right? Anytime people do demos, they think, oh, this is it. This is where we're going. This is the direction we're heading, right? Because no, man, this is just one possibility. Like, once again, I come from the startup world, right? We're smaller teams, right? So you can try out different things, right? Say you say you're looking for a new provider for metrics and stuff like this, or for your data, right? Okay, I can go out and do some things with New Relic, Datadog, you name it, right? Not a big deal, right? Enterprise is a little bit harder, right? Because it's not as easy to do so many POCs with so many vendors, right? So if you do, when you end up doing one, you kind of think, oh my god, this is what we're doing, right? So you kind of gotta like, nah, guys, we're just trying things out here, right? I'm not saying that this is the way we're going. This is one possibility, right? But this is kind of like one of the mind shift sets that you gotta try to undertake here, right? And once again, I'll go back. Always do your demo with your own stuff, right? It's gonna be way better, right? Okay, this is kind of similar, right? So I'm a big fan and proponent of promoting hybrid cloud, especially with the large like telcos, right? Because you know what, you got a big investment in on-prem. You got cameras in the arenas, man. That's not gonna appear. Your video feed isn't gonna appear in the cloud magically. You got to get up there somehow, right? So there you go. It's hybrid. It's always gonna be, there's always gonna be like some sort of interplay, between that, right? So maybe that's how you can start off small, right? So if people are hesitant about going 100% cloud, just push the hybrid connection, right? And what I've been doing a lot lately is like to get people comfortable with the idea. I said, okay, you know what? Our first path will be on-prem, right? But we'll scale to the cloud and we'll use it for disaster recovery, right? And so that seems to me a good way to put people at ease and to get more people sympathetic to their cause, right? And more willing to try out the cloud. Right? But I always put this caveat: hey, man, if you're going to use the cloud for DR purposes, disaster recovery, you better be willing to make a commitment, right? Because when stuff goes down, right, you just if you don't do stuff in the cloud regularly on a regular basis, right? At least for a small portion of your workflows, right? Just so it's still fresh and people know understand like how it works, right? So that's kind of my final thing here. Always start with like low risk content, right? So maybe you got say, right? Wow, we got a lot of different channels, right? And we service a lot of like very small television stations around the country, right? So maybe you don't want to use like your main Toronto stations, but you know what? Small town Ontario, hey, we'll put them in the clouds, see how it performs, right? Low risk, right? You don't have to worry about it, right? And final thing, especially when you talk about technology, it's always about corpsec, right? And so I'm going to assume not everyone on this call is like a DevOps expert here, so you might want to team up with the people on your team that are, right? So a lot of the stuff is like you got to show the corporate security people that you've got processes in place, to make sure that your stuff's not out leaking to the wild, right? So typically what a lot of the cloud providers will say is always about the least trust, right? Yeah, I've definitely been on one extreme of the spectrum where pretty much every single service is shut down. So you got to make a business case to open stuff up, right? I'm like, yo, that's too extreme, right? So you got to balance the least trust mentality with operational usability. Like, come on, man, we got to meet halfway here, right? But you know what? Especially with you in CorpSec, that's gonna be never ending. Chris, another one.
In 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 your experience, stuff like either C2PA or some of the kind of CDN tokenizations, would you say that's part of CorpSec in your kind of stories, or is that like a layer, or is that more like within what you as like a video architect is able to control?
I,
Oh, you're froze again.
yeah, am I back?
Yeah, you're back.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I would say that that's the type of security I would consider for my video workflows, right?
Okay.
But when you talk about the corporate security for the telcos, they think about other stuff, right? Basically, they just don't want DDoS attacks, right? Like that's what kind of what it boils down to, right? They don't want DDoS attacks on their infrastructure. They want to limit the blast radius in case they get in, right? That's kind of the main thing that they're looking for, right? So let's say you're using like you got identity management and stuff like that, right? You got to make sure, oh yeah, use two-factor authentication for everything, blah blah blah. It's that type of stuff, right? So it's a little bit different from like the security we think of from video, right?
Oh, okay. But like, so there are people inside the more the video focused place that are more focused on that part
Yeah.
versus this is more like network corporate security.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. That's what I'm talking about. Like, so when I'm saying corporate security, it's more networks corporate security, right?
Yeah.
And it's two different things. Like, so for example, the telco corporate security, it's not as if they're auditing our DRM systems, right? Or our authentication practice. They don't do stuff like that necessarily, right? So they just don't want people in the network. That's all they're coming from, right? The last point I want to put on this is what I call sovereignty. And this is okay, I'll be very specific what I'm talking about here, right? So when I first started doing like cloud experiments, especially at Bell, right? Like I sent everything to US East 1 or US West 2. And it's not obvious, but now we're in the AWS shop over at Bell, right? I'm trying not to plug them all, but yeah, that's what we use, right? So, and what I mean by this is I'm specifically testing AWS's like managed services, right? So media services, right? Now, at the time when I was testing, available in Canada yet, right? It's only available in US regions, right? So that's how I was testing, right? So I knew I could never get this past a corporate security if I want to implement this into production, right? Luckily, under like a lot of badgering, right? But they finally opened up media services in 2023. So into CA Central. So now it's okay, great. Now there's a chance we can actually get this thing approved, right? But it's not just us. Like I'm sure there's a lot of regions around the world, the same thing, especially like, at Bell, like what we'll do is we'll some like legal compliance issues here. Like you don't want that going all over the place, right? So that's why you got to keep it in Canada, right? So there are some rules around that, right? Okay, don't worry, guys, I'm almost done. All right. So this is fun stuff, finance. Ooh. I try to avoid this, but you can't, right? Because we're talking about big money here, right? Okay, so I think the best thing you can do is talk about TCO. So this is the total cost of ownership, right? So I kind of alluded to this earlier, right? So when you go up against the cloud skeptics, right, you got to make sure you're on the same like playing field here, right? So when you're saying, okay, how much is it going to cost? Well, make sure you include power, cooling, rack, the people power, the labor to maintain a data center, downtime with hardware failures, all that stuff, right? You got to account for that some way, right? If you don't do that, then you're not comparing what you can offer with the cloud, right? And sometimes I remind people, you know what? This is just like, hey, it's like putting up another data center. So you're not paying for the infrastructure of that, right? How's that a bad thing, right? You have more resiliency, So a lot of this is a mindset shift, right? And once again, I'd say talk to your cloud providers and talk to your partners because I'd say any sales engineer worth their grain of salt, they're going to provide you with slide decks and spreadsheets, right, in order to help do these calculations that you can present to your finance team, right? Say, hey, look at this. It's not so bad, right? Yeah, sure, maybe cost you a little bit more upfront, right? But look at the flexibility you can attain, right? So work with your providers. They can help you out with this type of stuff, right? And to make the finance team happy, I'd say just use some basic cloud best practices, right? Like for example, like storage tiering. It's like, you know what? You got 10 years worth of news clips. Do they really got to be in hot storage? Come on, man. Throw that stuff in the glacier or something like that. Like, come on, let's get real here, right? You got to at least do basic stuff like that, right? You want to talk about you want to right size your compute. like don't over provision your servers and stuff like that. The little drop down menus you can click on to help you choose like the right instances to use, just stuff like that. And I'm a big fan of this, like tagging your resources and charging back to the companies, right? So you got some greedy news division, they want to throw all their thing on hot storage. Well, you take it, and then you send them the bill. You're like, dude, what are you guys doing here, man? Little small things you can do, right? Of course, is reserved pricing and volume commits, right? And this is how you get your cost down, right? So obviously you got to run your stuff in the cloud for a little bit to see what your consumption patterns are like, right? But once you get an idea of what that is, right, talk to your cloud providers and say, hey, I want to reserve this many instances, give me a discount, and all that good stuff, right? And most of the cloud providers will also have a cloud optimization tools, right? Sometimes if you don't know how to use it, they'll help, right? And they'll teach you some tricks you can do to save on their costs, right? Because don't forget, your cloud, these are your partners, right? When you succeed, they succeed. They know very well, like, hey, the more business you're going to do, you're going to just consume more of their services, right? So it's in their best interest to help you, use the tools wisely, right? And this is what I call like changing the narrative here, right? So how am I talking the business and analysis of the companies, right? And all they do is talk about cost avoidance, right? Justifying their projects. Oh, we can save on this, we can save on that, right? And I'm like, it kind of harkens back to the scarcity versus growth mindset, right? So what I've been doing lately, I've been pushing back on them, and I thought about opportunity cost instead, right? On this, but what aren't we doing, right? How much is it? What's the cost for our delayed market entry? What's the cost of like the lost monetization opportunities, right? By being slow, right? What's the cost of like, losing market share to more agile competitors? Like you look at sports, you got Fubo TV, you got the Zone, you got all these great new streaming services that are coming out, right? Well, you're too slow because you're tethered to your, old infrastructure. You can't compete against those guys, right? And here's the biggest thing too. Okay, you got a lot of people who switch over. What's the cost of reacquiring your lost viewers? That's like churn. Like once they leave, they're not gonna come back, right? So you call all these cost savings. Well, you got to quantify this as well, and make things a little bit equal, right? And so it's kind of like I always say this, man. Numbers don't lie, right? But you know what? They can be manipulated. A lot of people are out there using numbers to narrative to their advantage, right? And it's the last thing I'm going to say is like, hey man, don't use cloud pricing as an excuse not to innovate, right? You got to kill that noise, right? You got to show them the positives of what it can do. All right. So this is it. That's not the end of my presentation. And what I'm hoping is that we can, start talking about stuff, right? Let's chat.
I have a couple of questions, but we'll see if anyone else has questions. Just unmute yourself. The question I had was kind of when you're talking about value for opportunity cost and I guess customer acquisition, how do you kind of model that the opportunity cost component? Like, do you look at kind of industry trends? I guess like with Bell, do they get are you able to kind of have access to larger kind of industry trends? And because Canada's smaller, you kind of have a better idea of what the churn would look like. And like if you were going to implement feature A, how much value can you attribute to that kind of feature?
Yeah, I gotta say, like usually when it comes to that, like I work.
You broke up. You might have to repeat that.
Yeah. So, okay. So basically, I work with a lot of business analysts on this, right? So I say this type of stuff, right? But I'm just taking. I don't have numbers to back. So the business analysts that I work with, right? These are the same people who will give you like viewership projections, right? So, okay. So as some of you may know, like I said, like Bell, we've got like, we get the rights to HBO, right? So one of the big shows that's coming, like launching, is The Last of Us season 2, which is a post-apocalyptic drama, right? So we expect it to do very well for us, right? So I don't know what they're using. I don't know what magic they're using to project viewership, but they got a formula, right? So typically, I'll I start talking to them. It's like, well, if you guys are able to project like viewership data, right? What about try to help me out here with like what trying to measure like opportunity costs, like you know what I mean, doing that type of stuff, right? You know, so we haven't. Like I said, this is all talk. I haven't produced any numbers yet, you know. But how they go about these things is like, yeah, they're definitely looking at industry trends. Typically, what's going on in the United States, right? They'll look at those views and try to do some sort of projection for Canada, right? So that's the rough MO how it's done.
Any other questions? I have a couple more, but let's leave it to the floor for a little bit. Anyone? Bueller? Bueller?
You can always type it out too if you guys don't want to talk, you know. So I got the chat window open.
Yeah. This was a question that I had. I was talking with someone, I think last week, and we were kind of talking about innovation kind of being over, I would say, like especially in the video space. Like everyone is like 264 is kind of the de facto codec. Um, where do you kind of see in the larger industry trends, at least for Canada, like where like video innovation can be kind of where's the biggest areas for, you know?
Well, okay. About is reducing network costs, right? So
Okay.
the big thing that they're focusing on is using like next level, right, to make the bits smaller, right? You know, so I think honestly AV1 is probably a little too ambitious, right? So if anything, they'll probably start with HEVC, right? You know, in order to like serve more of the HEVC bits to everyone, you know. So that's kind of the main thing they're doing. What I think they should be doing is looking using more like maybe say like machine learning and computer vision to have a more um, be a bit more flexible with your adaptive bitrate ladder, right? You know, so maybe there's some edge that you can do to like you know to really optimize how you're encoding how you're encoding your streams and depending what the content is, right? So I think it's a big advantage of that. Now, like I said, this is more for the network side, right? From
Right.
from the viewer side, in terms of like launching like cool products, it's really tough, right? Because I can definitely tell you that like so at Bell, like so I've been involved in projects where we're doing like stuff like real time like language translations for sports games. We're doing stuff like overlays for videos and stuff like that, right? Um, we're trying a bunch of stuff, but I wouldn't say that we're seeing necessarily like any like rise in terms of viewership. Um, I think though this is more of a cumulative effect, right? You know, and what I try to say is like, hey, we should try to keep our production costs as low as possible so we can try these experiments, right? I don't one thing is going to like raise our viewerships, right? But it's more like coming out consistently with a suite of new services and streaming experiences, right? To show that hey, there's value. Hey, if I'm paying you for your subscription, right? I want some new stuff, right? You know, so you just keep on doing stuff until it works. I'm actually hey, this is for you, Chris.
Yeah, no, Aaron works.
Ah,
I work with Aaron, so Aaron's just making a comment about uh, some of the things that we're working on.
yeah, that's big. Like a lot, like most of the providers, they're definitely thinking about this, right? Like that's for sure.
Mm, okay, well, yeah, I think we'll just end it at that.
Yeah.
So,
All right. Cool.
all right, so thanks everyone. Thank you, Trevor. That was a fun kind of journey through all the things that you need to consider when kind of going to the cloud. And you know, thank you for taking time out of your day and answering some of the questions. So thank you everyone for coming, and I'll keep you posted on who I can finagle into doing a talk next month. So until next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Yep.
Have a good day.
Cheers.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.